You need to hear this. Before you close this video, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another story about money. This is about a billionaire who had everything the world could offer, and still couldn't close his eyes at night. Until one evening, in the quiet of his empty penthouse, a 3-year-old girl who wasn't even his own began to sing. And what that little voice woke up inside him, nobody, not even he, saw coming. Hey friends, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight and which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's here with me for this one. Tonight's story is about a man who built an empire but forgot how to feel, a mother who worked with tired hands but never lost her heart, and a little girl whose innocent song became the one thing that money could never buy. Stay with me. This one gets deep. The city never slept, but neither did Nathan Cole, and for very different reasons. At 30 years old, Nathan owned more than most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. Skyscrapers with his name etched into brass plaques. A private jet that sat waiting on a runway in Teterboro, fueled and ready, whether he used it once a year or once a month. A penthouse on the 62nd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the entire city into a glittering carpet beneath his feet. He had everything a young man from nowhere could have dreamed of. And yet, most nights, he lay awake staring at the ceiling until 3, 4, sometimes 5 in the morning, his mind refusing to let him rest. It hadn't always been like this. There had been a time, a long time ago, when Nathan slept like any other child, easily, deeply, without a single thought pressing on his chest. But that was before his mother passed away. Before his father, a hard and unshakable businessman named Richard Cole, decided that grief was a weakness the Cole family could not afford to show. Before 8-year-old Nathan learned to swallow his tears in private and present a composed face to the world, because that was what his father demanded of him. "Cole men don't cry, Nathan," his father used to say, standing tall in doorways, never quite looking at him the way a father should look at a son. "Cole men build things. They don't fall apart." So Nathan built things. He built spreadsheets before he built friendships. He built companies before he built memories. By the time he was 22, he had turned a small tech investment into a fortune that made headlines. By 25, Forbes had put his face on their cover with the words, "The boy who never stops." By 30, he was one of the richest men in the country and one of the loneliest. His father had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind an empire and a silence that Nathan still didn't know what to do with. There had been no warmth between them at the end, only paperwork, only a legacy passed down like a burden dressed up as a gift. Nathan inherited towers of glass and steel, bank accounts with more zeros than he could count, and an emptiness that no amount of money seemed able to fill. He had no wife, no children. Friends, if you could call them that, who mostly wanted something from him. Every night, in that enormous penthouse with its imported Italian furniture and its silent, echoing hallways, Nathan Cole lay in a bed big enough for a family and felt more alone than a man stranded on an island. It was his housekeeper, Rosa Delgado, who had been the only steady presence in that apartment for the past year. Rosa was 34. A single mother who had come to the city 8 years earlier with nothing but a suitcase and a dream that things would be better for her daughter than they had been for her. Her husband had passed away when their little girl was barely a year old, leaving Rosa to raise their daughter alone, working double shifts, saving every spare dollar, refusing every offer of pity along the way. She was proud, hardworking, and endlessly warm. The kind of woman who hummed while she folded laundry and who somehow always found a kind word for people who didn't deserve one, including her exhausted, distant employer. Her daughter Ellie was 3 years old, with a mop of dark curls and a laugh that could fill an empty room. Because Rosa couldn't always afford a babysitter, and because her shifts sometimes ran late into the evening, Nathan had told her, almost reluctantly, in a rare moment of decency, that she could bring Ellie along when she had no other choice. He hadn't expected to notice the child much. He barely noticed anyone. But Ellie noticed him. She would peek around corners at him with wide, curious eyes. She would leave crayon drawings on his kitchen counter. Crooked sons, purple dogs, a stick figure family that always, strangely, included him standing beside her and her mother. She called him Mr. Nate, in a voice too sweet for him to correct her. That particular night, the city outside Nathan's window buzzed with a million tiny lights, taxis crawling like fireflies through the streets far below. He had a 9 a.m. meeting that would decide the fate of a merger worth $900 million. And he needed sleep. He needed it badly. His eyes were dry with exhaustion. His shoulders tight with a tension that never fully left his body anymore. He tried everything. He turned off every light. He counted numbers he'd stopped believing in. He replayed the quarterly report in his mind until the figures blurred together like static. Nothing worked. Sleep, it seemed, had become another thing his money couldn't buy. Around 11 o'clock, Rosa knocked softly and told him she was finishing up the last of the dishes and that Ellie had fallen asleep on the living room couch. And would he mind if she let her rest just a little longer before waking her for the ride home? Nathan, staring blankly at his ceiling, mumbled that it was fine, barely registering the words. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Ellie wouldn't stay asleep much longer. And when she woke up in the unfamiliar dark of that towering apartment, she wouldn't cry, and she wouldn't call for her mother. She would wander, small bare feet padding softly across marble floors, toward the one sliver of light coming from beneath a bedroom door. And she would do something that no boardroom, no bank account, and no inheritance had ever managed to do for Nathan Cole. She would reach him. She had no idea what time it was, only that the couch felt too quiet without her mother humming nearby, and the dark felt too big for a room she didn't know. Ellie rubbed her eyes and sat up slowly on the enormous leather couch, blinking at the strange shapes of furniture she didn't recognize. The living room, so full of light and life during the day, looked different at night. Taller somehow, colder, the city lights outside the window throwing long silver shadows across the floor. She looked around for her mother's familiar shape, the soft sound of her voice, the warm smell of the dish soap she always used. But the kitchen was empty. The hallway was silent. A little girl of 3 doesn't always cry when she's scared. Sometimes she just starts walking. Ellie slid off the couch, her small feet touching the cool marble floor, and padded quietly across the living room. She wasn't the kind of child who panicked easily. Her mother had always told her that Ellie had an old soul, that she seemed to understand things far beyond her years, that she had a way of sensing when someone needed comfort even before they knew it themselves. Perhaps that was why, instead of turning toward the kitchen where her mother's voice still murmured faintly over running water, Ellie turned the other way. Down the long hallway, past framed photographs of buildings Nathan had built and awards he had won, past a hallway table with flowers that were replaced every week by someone whose name Nathan didn't even know, she saw it, a thin line of golden light spilling out from beneath the door. She didn't know that this was Mr. Nate's room. She didn't know that behind that door was a man who hadn't slept properly in years, a man whose company was worth more than some small countries, a man who had built a life so large and so cold that warmth had become a stranger to him. All Ellie knew was that there was light, and light usually meant safety. She reached up, small fingers barely able to turn the handle, and pushed the door open. Nathan heard it before he saw it, the soft creak of hinges, the faint pad of tiny feet against the floor. He turned his head on the pillow, momentarily too tired and too surprised to react, and found himself looking at Ellie standing in the doorway in her little cotton pajamas, hair a wild halo of curls around her face, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed soft from years of love. "Ellie," he said, sitting up slightly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You should be with your mom, sweetheart." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked further into the room, small and fearless, the way only children can be in spaces adults have long since learned to guard. She stopped beside his enormous bed, looking up at him with dark, serious eyes that seemed far too old for a face so young. "You look sad, Mr. Nate," she said simply. Nathan opened his mouth to correct her, to say the practiced words he always used when someone got too close to the truth. "I'm fine, just tired, long day at the office." But something about the directness of a 3-year-old's gaze made the words die in his throat. Children had a way of seeing past the walls adults spent years building. "I'm just having trouble sleeping," he said instead, which was as close to honesty as he'd come in longer than he could remember. Ellie tilted her head, considering this with the seriousness of a tiny philosopher. "My mommy sings to me when I can't sleep," she said. "It always works." Nathan almost smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching in a way that felt unfamiliar, like a muscle he hadn't used in years. "Is that so?" She nodded firmly, climbing up onto the edge of his massive bed without waiting for permission, settling herself cross-legged on the covers like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nathan should have called for Rosa. He should have told the child to go back to her mother, that this wasn't appropriate, that billionaires didn't have 3-year-olds perched on their beds in the middle of the night. But he found himself staying silent, watching her with a strange, quiet curiosity he couldn't explain. "Do you want me to sing to you?" Lee asked. The question caught him so off guard that for a moment, Nathan didn't know how to respond. No one had offered to sing him to sleep since he was a very small boy, since a mother whose face had begun to blur at the edges of his memory used to sit at the edge of his bed and hum old songs until his eyes grew heavy. He hadn't thought about that memory in years. He'd buried it, the way he buried everything soft and painful, beneath layers of ambition and work and silence. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "I want to," Ellie said, with the simple certainty only a child could have. And before he could argue further, she began. Her voice was small and slightly off-key, the voice of a toddler who had learned the song from a mother who sang it while doing dishes and folding laundry, not from any professional training. It wasn't a famous song. It wasn't a lullaby you'd hear on the radio. It was something Rosa had made up herself years ago. A simple, wandering little tune about the moon watching over tired hearts and morning always coming after the dark. Nathan lay frozen, staring at this small child sitting on his bed, singing in the dim golden light of his bedroom, and felt something inside his chest crack open, slowly, painfully, like ice beginning to thaw after a very long winter. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere down that same hallway, Rosa had just noticed her daughter was missing from the couch. And she was about to walk into a moment that would change the course of both of their lives forever. Rosa's heart nearly stopped when she walked into the living room and found the couch empty. "Ellie," she called softly, trying to keep the panic out of her voice as she scanned the darkened room, the kitchen, the hallway bathroom. Her daughter was small, curious, and fearless in a way that terrified Rosa more nights than she'd ever admit. In a home this size, with balconies 62 floors above the street and countless rooms a toddler could wander into, every second of silence felt like an hour. "Ellie, baby, where are you?" She moved quickly down the hallway, her socked feet silent against the marble, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then she heard it, faint, drifting from beneath a door she rarely had reason to open. Small voice singing. Rosa slowed her steps, confusion replacing panic as she recognized the melody. It was her own song, the one she'd hummed to Ellie every night since she was born, the one she'd written herself in the exhausted tender months after her husband died, when she needed something to hold on to in the dark just as much as her infant daughter did. Why was Ellie singing it here? And to whom? She reached the door, which stood slightly ajar, and peered inside. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Ellie was sitting cross-legged on Nathan Cole's bed, her small hands resting in her lap, singing softly with her eyes half closed the way she always did when she sang from the heart and not just from memory. And Nathan, the reserved, unreachable, endlessly tired man Rosa had worked for over the past year, the man who rarely said more than a distracted thank you as he passed through his own kitchen, was sitting upright against his pillows, completely still, tears sliding silently down his face. Rosa froze in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt or disappear. She had never seen Nathan cry. She wasn't sure anyone had. Ellie's small voice trailed off as the song came to its gentle end, and for a long moment, the room was quiet except for the distant hum of the city below. Nathan wiped at his face quickly, almost embarrassed, though the movement was too late to hide what Rosa had already witnessed. "I'm sorry," Rosa said quickly, stepping into the doorway properly now. Her voice hushed with apology. "Mr. Cole, I didn't know she'd wandered off. It's all right," Nathan said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he hadn't let himself feel in front of another person in years. "She was just singing me a song." Rosa's eyes moved between her daughter's innocent face and her employer's uncharacteristically open one, and something in her chest softened with understanding, even though she didn't yet know the whole story. She crossed the room and gently scooped Ellie into her arms, the toddler immediately nestling into her mother's shoulder, already half asleep again from the effort of her late-night performance. "That song," Nathan said quietly, before Rosa could turn to leave. "Where did she learn it?" "I made it up," Rosa admitted, a little shy about it, the way people often are about things that came from the rawest parts of themselves. "After my husband passed. I didn't have much money for fancy lullaby albums or anything like that, so I just made something up. Something to get us both through the nights." Nathan nodded slowly, staring at a point somewhere past her shoulder, lost in a memory he hadn't visited in over 20 years. "My mother used to sing to me," he said, so quietly Rosa almost didn't hear it. "When I was young. Before she passed. I haven't thought about it in God, I don't even know how long. I forgot the sound of being sung to sleep." Rosa stood very still, sensing the weight of what was happening, the strange, fragile honesty in the room that felt like it could shatter if she said the wrong thing. "Grief has a way of taking more than the person we lose," she said gently. "It takes the little things too if we let it. The songs, the softness. Sometimes we don't even notice they're gone until something brings them back." Nathan looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he hadn't looked at another person in longer than he could remember. Not as an employee, not as a function performing a role in the machine of his household, but as a woman who had built an entire life out of loss and love and had somehow, impossibly, kept her heart open through all of it. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep going, keep feeling things after everything you've lost?" Rosa considered the question seriously, shifting Ellie's weight gently on her hip. "Because closing yourself off doesn't bring anyone back," she said. "It just makes sure you're alone for the rest of the journey. I decided a long time ago that grief could take my husband, but it couldn't take my joy. It couldn't take her." She glanced down at her sleeping daughter. "Every night I sing that song, I'm not just putting her to sleep. I'm reminding myself that love didn't die with him. It just changed shape." The words settled over Nathan like something physical, pressing gently against the calloused, guarded parts of his chest that he'd spent 2 decades reinforcing. He thought of his father's voice. "Coal men don't cry, coal men build things," and he thought of how much he had built, how much he had achieved, and how staggeringly empty it had left him. "I haven't let myself feel anything in a long time," he admitted, the confession slipping out before he could stop it, strange and unfamiliar in his own mouth. "I didn't even realize how much I'd shut down until just now." Rosa offered him a small, understanding smile, the kind that held no judgment, only recognition. "Sometimes it takes someone small to remind us of something big," she said, glancing down at Ellie again. "She has a way of finding the people who need her most." She turned to leave then, murmuring a soft good night, carrying her sleeping daughter toward the door. But just as she reached the threshold, Nathan spoke again. His voice quiet but steady in a way it hadn't been in years. "Rosa," he said. "Thank you. Truly." She paused, looking back at him. This powerful, wealthy, deeply lonely man sitting alone in an enormous bed in an enormous apartment, finally cracked open by the simple, unpolished song of a 3-year-old girl. "You're welcome, Mr. Cole," she said softly. "Good night." The door clicked shut behind her, and Nathan sat alone in the golden lamplight, tears still drying on his face, feeling something shift inside him that he didn't yet have words for. He didn't know it that night, but something had begun. A door, long sealed shut inside him, had creaked open for the first time in over 20 years. And once open, it would not close again so easily. Nathan didn't sleep at all that night, but for the first time in years, it wasn't dread keeping him awake. It was something closer to restlessness of the heart, a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. He lay in the dark long after Rosa and Ellie had gone home, replaying the conversation over and over, turning her words in his mind the way he used to turn over quarterly reports, searching for meaning in every sentence. Sometimes we don't even notice they're gone until something brings them back. He thought of his mother's voice, faded now to almost nothing in his memory, and felt a fresh wave of grief for a woman he'd lost 22 years ago and never properly mourned. Around 4 in the morning, unable to lie still any longer, Nathan got up and wandered into the small study off his bedroom, a room he rarely used except to sign documents his assistant left for him. In the back of one drawer, beneath old contracts and forgotten pens, sat a box he hadn't opened in years. His father's old files, boxed up after the funeral and never properly gone through. Nathan had never had the heart or maybe the courage to look through them. That night something pulled him toward it. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. Perhaps some trace of his mother. Photograph. Letter. Something to hold on to now that the memory of her had been so suddenly, painfully reawakened. He lifted the lid and began sifting through yellowed papers, old building permits, employee records from the earliest days of coal construction, back when his father was still building the empire from the ground up, literally, with cranes and steel beams and crews of men working double shifts on Manhattan high-rises. And then a name stopped him cold. Miguel Delgado. Nathan stared at the paper in his hands, a faded incident report from 9 years earlier, back when coal construction was finishing one of its first major towers downtown. The report was brief, clinical, the kind of language companies used when they wanted a tragedy to sound like a footnote. Scaffolding failure. Structural fatigue. Not properly inspected due to schedule pressures. 1 worker fatality. Miguel Delgado, age 27, survived by wife and infant daughter. Nathan's hands began to shake. He knew that name. He'd heard it only hours earlier, spoken softly by a woman standing in his bedroom doorway. "My husband passed away when our little girl was barely a year old." Rosa hadn't said how. She hadn't needed to, not until now. But there it was in black and white, buried in a box his father had kept hidden for 9 years. The truth of how Miguel Delgado had died, and the company responsible for it. Nathan's own company. His father's company. The empire he had inherited. He read further, his stomach turning with every line. There had been a settlement, a quiet one, handled by lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear before they reached a courtroom or a headline. A modest payout, an admission of nothing, a family sent away with just enough money to survive and a signature that ensured they'd never speak of it publicly. Richard Cole had prioritized the tower's opening deadline over a proper safety inspection, and a 27-year-old husband and father had paid the price for it. Rosa had been working in his home for over a year, cleaning his floors, cooking his meals, letting her daughter play in his living room, entirely unaware that the man employing her was the son of the man whose company had taken her husband from her. And Nathan had been living in blissful, wealthy ignorance, never once looking closely enough at his own father's history to know the truth. He sat on the floor of his study until the sun began to rise over the city, the paper trembling in his hands, grappling with a guilt so heavy it nearly took his breath away. This was what his father had built his fortune on. Not just brilliance and risk, but shortcuts, silence, and a family's shattered life quietly buried in a box. Coal men don't cry. Coal men build things. Now Nathan understood with sickening clarity exactly what his father had been willing to build over. He thought about Rosa's face the night before, warm and open despite everything life had taken from her. He thought about Ellie, 3 years old, singing a stranger to sleep with a lullaby made from her mother's grief, utterly unaware that the man she called Mr. Nate held a truth in his home that could shatter the fragile trust growing between them. For a long time, Nathan considered simply putting the papers back in the box, sealing it, letting the past stay buried the way his father had intended. No one would ever know. Rosa would never find out. He could continue benefiting from an empire built partly on her husband's death, and the world would keep spinning exactly as it always had. But then he thought of Rosa's words again. Grief could take my husband, but it couldn't take my joy. She had built a life of warmth and honesty out of the wreckage of a tragedy that his own family had caused and covered up. And he had spent years hiding behind glass towers and boardrooms, terrified of feeling anything at all. He couldn't keep living behind a lie the size of his father's. Not after last night. Not after Ellie's song had cracked something open in him that couldn't be sealed shut again. By the time the sun had fully risen over Manhattan, painting his penthouse in soft morning gold, Nathan Cole had made a decision that would change everything. For Rosa, for Ellie, and for the empire he'd inherited but never truly understood. He was going to tell her the truth. And whatever happened after that, he would face it honestly, for the first time in his adult life. He heard the front door open around 8, Rosa's familiar footsteps in the hallway. Her voice calling a soft good morning to the empty apartment. Nathan closed the box, set the incident report gently on top of his desk, and stood. His heart pounding harder than it had before any merger, any negotiation, any deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This conversation would be the hardest of his life. But for the first time in 20 years, Nathan Cole was no longer running from what he felt. He was walking straight toward it. Rosa was in the kitchen, humming softly as she filled the coffee maker. Ellie perched on a stool at the counter drawing something in crayon with fierce 3-year-old concentration, when Nathan walked in holding a single sheet of paper like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. His face had none of its usual composed distance. It was pale, tight. His eyes rimmed red from a night without sleep. She set down the coffee pot. Mr. Cole, are you all right? Rosa, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. Can we talk? Somewhere private. Something in his tone made her stomach tighten with unease. She glanced at Ellie, who was fully absorbed in coloring a purple sun, then gestured toward the small sitting area near the window, out of easy earshot. She followed him, arms crossed loosely over her chest, bracing herself for something. Perhaps he'd decided the arrangement of bringing Ellie to work wasn't appropriate after all. Perhaps last night's vulnerability had embarrassed him, and this was the awkward retraction employers often gave the morning after showing too much of themselves. She wasn't prepared for what actually came. Last night, after you and Ellie went home, Nathan began, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. I found something. In my father's old files. I need you to know I had no idea, Rosa. I swear to you until last night I had no idea. He handed her the paper. Rosa's eyes moved across the page, and Nathan watched her face change in real time. Confusion, then recognition, then a devastating dawning horror as she reached her husband's name. Her hand flew to her mouth. The paper shook in her grip. This is... Her voice broke. This is Miguel's accident report. My father's company, Nathan said, forcing the words out even as his throat closed around them. Cole Construction. That tower. It was ours. My father pushed the deadline, cut corners on the inspection, and your husband paid for it with his life. And then he paid your family to stay quiet about it. Rosa's legs seemed to give slightly, and she sank onto the edge of a nearby chair, still staring at the paper as if it might rearrange itself into something less devastating if she looked hard enough. 9 years of grief, 9 years of believing Miguel's death had been an unavoidable accident, an unfair twist of fate rather than a tragedy that could have been prevented with a single honest inspection. "You knew," she whispered, and the question landed like a blow, though it wasn't accusatory yet, just raw disbelief. "No," Nathan said quickly, kneeling in front of her chair so he could look directly into her eyes. "No, Rosa, I swear on everything I have, I did not know. I inherited this company after my father died. I never looked closely at the old case files, the old settlements. I trusted that everything my father built was clean, because I didn't want to know otherwise. That's on me. That's a failure I have to own. But I did not know about Miguel. Not until 4 hours ago." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between his face and the paper still trembling in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, filled with a grief that had clearly never fully healed, just been carefully managed for 9 long years. "Do you know what those 2 years after he died were like?" she asked. "I worked 3 jobs. I left Ellie with a neighbor I barely trusted because I couldn't afford proper childcare. I skipped meals so she wouldn't have to. I told myself it was just terrible luck that construction accidents happen, that no one was to blame because believing otherwise felt unbearable. And now you're telling me someone was to blame. Your family made a choice that killed my husband, and then paid us to disappear quietly so it wouldn't cost them anything more than money." "Yes," Nathan said, and he didn't try to soften it, didn't try to explain it away the way lawyers and executives had clearly done 9 years earlier. "That's exactly what happened. And I am so sorry. Sorry doesn't undo it, I know that. But I needed you to hear the truth from me, honestly, even though I could have kept it buried and you'd never have known." Rosa stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, staring out at the city that had taken so much from her and given so little back until, strangely, Nathan's own home had become a small refuge over the past year. Her shoulders shook slightly, though whether from anger or grief or both, Nathan couldn't tell. "I sang in your bedroom last night," she said quietly, almost to herself. "My daughter sang your dead mother's memory back to life. And this whole time, you were living off the money that came from taking her father away." "I understand if you want to quit," Nathan said, his voice thick. "I understand if you never want to see me again. I won't blame you. I won't fight you on anything you need. Financially, legally, whatever it takes to make this right, or as right as something like this can ever be made." Rosa turned back to face him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. In the kitchen behind them, Ellie's small voice hummed softly to herself as she colored, utterly unaware that her innocent song the night before had unearthed a truth 9 years buried. "I need time," Rosa finally said, her voice steadier now, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I need to think. This isn't something I can just accept in one conversation." "Take all the time you need," Nathan said immediately. "I'm not going anywhere. And Rosa, whatever you decide about your job, about all of this, I intend to make this right. Not because it erases anything. Because it's the only decent thing left to do." Rosa nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, and walked back toward the kitchen where her daughter waited, still humming, still innocent, still entirely unaware that she had just become the reason 2 broken families' histories had finally collided. Nathan watched her go, the incident report still resting on the chair where she'd left it, and understood that nothing about his life, or hers, would ever be quite the same again. 3 days passed, and Rosa didn't come to work. Nathan told himself he understood. He told her to take all the time she needed, and he meant it, even as the silence in his penthouse grew heavier with every hour that passed without the sound of her humming in the kitchen, without Ellie's crayons scattered across his counter, without the small, unexpected warmth that had begun creeping into corners of his life he hadn't realized were cold. He didn't call her. He didn't want to pressure her into anything, didn't want to be one more powerful man rushing a grieving woman toward forgiveness on his own timeline. So he waited, and while he waited he worked. Not the way he used to work, chasing numbers and mergers and quarterly growth. He pulled every file Cole Construction had ever produced related to worker safety, going back 15 years. He hired an independent auditing firm, not one connected to his company's usual circle of lawyers and accountants, and told them to look at everything. Every project, every inspection, every corner that might have been cut in the name of deadlines and profit margins. He wanted the truth laid bare, however ugly it turned out to be, because he understood now that ignorance had never been innocence. It had simply been convenient. The audit surfaced 2 more incidents. Nothing as severe as what had happened to Miguel Delgado, but enough. A worker who'd lost partial use of his hand on a site where safety equipment had been outdated, a family displaced during a demolition that skipped a required environmental review to save time. Nathan read every report with a growing, sickening understanding of the man his father had truly been, and the empire that had been built, brick by brick, on shortcuts dressed up as efficiency. He began making calls. Quiet ones at first, then more direct ones. He reached out to the worker with the injured hand, now in his 50s, and arranged for the surgery and rehabilitation the man had never been able to afford, along with a settlement that came without a single gag clause attached. He reached out to the displaced family and helped relocate them to permanent housing. No strings, no conditions, no lawyers hovering nearby to protect Cole Construction's reputation instead of the people it had harmed. None of it undid anything. He knew that. But for the first time since his father's death, Nathan felt like he was building something honest, even if it was built from the wreckage of dishonesty. On the 4th day, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Rosa standing in the hallway, Ellie's small hand held in hers, both of them dressed for a normal day of work, though Rosa's expression was anything but casual. Her eyes were tired, rimmed faintly with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent several sleepless nights wrestling with an impossible question. "Rosa," Nathan said, surprised, stepping back to let them in. "I wasn't expecting." "I need to say some things," she interrupted gently, "and I need you to listen without trying to fix it while I'm talking." "Okay," Nathan said quietly. "I'm listening." Ellie, sensing the seriousness in the air the way young children often do, wandered toward the living room and settled onto the floor with a small toy, giving the adult space without being asked. Rosa took a breath. "I spent 3 days so angry I could barely see straight," she said. "Angry at your father, obviously. But angry at you too, even though some small part of me knew that wasn't entirely fair. I kept thinking about all those months you barely looked at me, barely said more than 2 words when you passed through the kitchen, while I dusted photographs of buildings that existed because men like Miguel broke their backs building them. I thought about how easy your life has been while mine has been a constant fight just to keep Ellie fed and safe." Nathan didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, just nodded, absorbing every word the way he knew he needed to. "But then," Rosa continued, her voice softening slightly, "I heard things. From people I know in the neighborhood. A man named Frank, works construction, said Cole Construction called him about a hand injury from years back, offered to cover surgery he'd given up hoping for. Then I heard about the Ruiz family finally getting real housing after being bounced around for years. And I started to wonder if maybe I was looking at 2 different men. The father who built an empire on other people's suffering, and the son who is trying, clumsily, imperfectly, but genuinely, to tear that foundation up and build something better. I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness, Nathan said quietly. I want to be clear about that. Nothing I do can undo what happened to Miguel, or to you, or to Ellie growing up without her father. I'm not doing this to earn anything from you. I know, Rosa said, and for the first time in days, something like warmth returned to her expression. That's exactly why I came back today. Because if you were doing it for me, for my forgiveness, it would feel hollow. But you're doing it because it's right. And that tells me something about who you actually are. Separate from your father, separate from the name on all those buildings. Nathan felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since Rosa walked out 3 days earlier. Does this mean? He started carefully, unsure how to even phrase the question. "It means I'm not ready to say everything is fine," Rosa said honestly. "Because it isn't, and it might not ever fully be. But it means I'm willing to keep working here, keep being part of your life and Ellie being part of it too while we figure out what healing looks like. One day at a time." From the living room, Ellie's voice rang out suddenly, cheerful and oblivious to the weight of the conversation that had just concluded. "Mr. Nate, come see my castle." Nathan glanced toward the living room, then back at Rosa, a small, tentative smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "Should we go see the castle?" Rosa's mouth curved upward too, the first real smile he'd seen from her in days. "We should definitely go see the castle." As they walked together toward the living room, toward a little girl building something out of blocks with the same fierce, uncomplicated joy she brought to everything, Nathan understood that something fragile and important was beginning to take root between all three of them. Not quite friendship yet, not quite family, but something reaching, tentatively, toward both. Neither of them yet knew that the hardest part of the truth was still waiting to surface. One more secret buried in Richard Cole's files, one that would test whether the fragile trust they'd just begun to rebuild could survive a second, even harder blow. 2 weeks passed, and something like normalcy began to settle over Nathan's penthouse, though it was a different kind of normal than before. Rosa still came every weekday, still hummed while she worked, though there was a new ease between her and Nathan now, an honesty that hadn't existed before the truth had cracked everything open. Ellie had taken to greeting Nathan every morning with a running hug around his knees, calling out "Mr. Nate." With the same delighted certainty she greeted every good thing in her small world. Nathan found himself leaving the office earlier than he had in years, no longer dreading the empty silence of his apartment, because it wasn't quite as empty anymore. He'd started joining them for dinner some evenings, simple meals Rosa cooked in his enormous, underused kitchen. Arroz con pollo, or grilled cheese cut into triangles for Ellie, who insisted triangles tasted better than squares. He'd started learning things about himself he hadn't known in years, that he liked the sound of a child laughing in the next room while he worked, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to the end of a workday, that healing, it turned out, could happen in small, unglamorous moments around a kitchen table. But the audit Nathan had commissioned wasn't finished. And on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the independent firm sent him a final report that made his stomach drop all over again. It wasn't about another accident. It was about money. Buried deep in Cole Construction's early financial records, from back when the company was still climbing toward its first real success, was a series of transactions that made no sense on their surface. Payments routed through shell arrangements, funds diverted from a city housing grant meant to subsidize affordable units in one of the company's earliest developments. Nathan stared at the numbers for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. His father hadn't just cut corners on safety. Nearly a decade before Miguel Delgado's death, Richard Cole had defrauded a city housing program, pocketing funds meant to keep working-class families in their homes, and used part of that money to help finance the very tower where, years later, Miguel would fall to his death. Nathan sat in his study with the report for a long time, feeling the ground shift beneath him yet again. He'd thought the worst of his father's sins had already surfaced. He'd been wrong. That evening, when Rosa arrived with Ellie, Nathan found himself hesitating outside his own kitchen, the new report weighing in his hand like a second confession he wasn't sure he had the strength to give. He'd promised himself honesty, no matter how ugly. But watching Rosa laugh softly at something Ellie said, watching the fragile piece they'd only just begun rebuilding, some small, cowardly part of him wondered if this particular truth needed to come out at all. The housing fraud was decades old. The people harmed were scattered, some possibly no longer even in the city. Surely, he told himself, some sins could stay buried without hurting anyone further. But even as he thought it, he heard his father's voice again, cold and certain. Coal men don't cry. Coal men build things. And Nathan understood with sudden clarity that choosing silence now, even about something that didn't touch Rosa directly, would mean becoming exactly the kind of man his father had been. A man who buried inconvenient truths in boxes and called it strength. He walked into the kitchen. "Rosa," he said, and something in his voice made her turn immediately, Ellie's laughter fading as she, too, sensed the shift in the room. "There's something else. In the audit. I need to tell you, and I need to tell the people it affects, whoever I can still find." Rosa set down the towel in her hands slowly, studying his face. "What is it?" Nathan explained it as clearly as he could. The housing grant, the diverted funds, the families who might have lost affordable housing they were owed because his father chose profit over promises made to a city trying to help its most vulnerable residents. He watched Rosa's expression shift from confusion to a kind of weary, familiar heaviness, the look of someone bracing for one more wave in an ocean that never seemed to stop churning. "How many families?" she asked quietly. "The report doesn't have exact numbers yet. Dozens possibly. Maybe more, across 2 different projects." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, staring at some point past his shoulder. "You know," she finally said, "most men in your position would burn that report and never think about it again. No one's asking these questions but you." "That doesn't make it right to stay silent," Nathan said. "Especially not now. Especially not after everything." Something in Rosa's expression softened, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to respect. "So what are you going to do?" "Find them," Nathan said, the decision settling into place as he spoke it aloud. "Every family that Grant should have helped. However long it takes, however much it costs. And I'm going to make it public. Not to look good, but because families deserve to know the truth about what happened to money that was supposed to help them stay in their homes." Rosa studied him for a long moment, and Nathan understood she was searching his face the way she must have searched it 100 times over the past 2 weeks, testing whether the man standing in front of her was becoming someone genuinely different from the empire that had shaped him. "That's going to cost you," she said finally. "Financially. Reputationally. People will ask why you're dragging your own father's name through the mud." "Let them ask," Nathan said. "I spent 30 years building a life around never disappointing my father, never questioning what he built. I'm done being loyal to a lie just because it's comfortable." From the doorway, unnoticed until that moment, Ellie's small voice piped up. "Are you sad again, Mr. Nate?" Nathan looked down at her. This small girl who had unknowingly cracked open the first domino in a chain reaction that was now reshaping his entire understanding of himself, his family, and the empire he'd inherited. He crouched down to her level, the way he'd seen Rosa do 100 times. "A little sad," he admitted honestly. "But also trying to do something good. Something your mom taught me matters, even when it's hard." Ellie considered this with her usual serious 3-year-old gravity, then reached out and patted his cheek gently, the way one might comfort a friend. "It's okay, Mr. Nate. Good things take time. Mommy says that too." Nathan felt his throat tighten, glancing up at Rosa, who was watching the exchange with tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "Your daughter," he said quietly, "keeps saying exactly what I need to hear, exactly when I need to hear it." "She has a gift," Rosa said softly, wiping at her eyes. "Always has. I don't know where she gets it." What none of them knew yet, what waited just around the corner in the weeks to come, was that finding the families affected by the old housing fraud would lead Nathan somewhere he never expected, back to a name from his own distant childhood, and a connection between his family and Rosa's that went back far deeper than either of them had ever imagined. The name Nathan found 3 weeks later stopped him in his tracks a second time. He'd hired a small team to track down every family potentially affected by the diverted housing grant, cross-referencing old city records with Cole Construction's buried financial documents. It was slow, painstaking work, made harder by the fact that many of the original tenants had moved multiple times over the years, some out of the city entirely, some impossible to trace at all. But one afternoon, his lead investigator, a patient, thorough woman named Angela Ruiz, no relation to the family Nathan had already helped rehouse, called him with something unexpected. "There's a name here I think you should see for yourself," she said. "Before I tell you what I found, I want you to look at the original tenant list from the first building." She sent over a scanned document, decades old, listing the original families meant to receive subsidized units in one of Cole Construction's earliest developments, the very grant his father had defrauded. Nathan scrolled through the faded list of names, mostly unfamiliar, until one stopped him cold. Elena Delgado. His hands went still on the keyboard. It wasn't Rosa's name, but the surname alone made his pulse quicken. He called Angela back immediately. "Elena Delgado," he said. "Do we know who that is?" "That's what I wanted to flag," Angela said. "I did some digging. Elena Delgado was Miguel Delgado's mother, Rosa's mother-in-law. She was on the original list to receive one of the subsidized units, back when your father's company first broke ground on that development. She never got it. The unit went instead to a family with connections to a city official, who apparently looked the other way on the fraud in exchange for the arrangement. Elena spent the next several years in unstable housing, moving between relatives, before she passed away 11 years ago." Nathan sat back slowly in his chair, the pieces arranging themselves into a picture almost too painful to look at directly. His father's company hadn't just caused Miguel Delgado's death 9 years ago. Nearly 2 decades earlier, that same company had denied Miguel's own mother the stable, affordable home she'd been promised. A home that might have changed the entire trajectory of that family's life, might have given Miguel a more stable childhood, might have altered a chain of circumstances that eventually led to a scaffolding collapse on a rushed construction deadline years later. The Cole family and the Delgado family weren't simply connected through one tragic accident. They were tangled together across 2 full decades, 2 generations, through a pattern of choices Richard Cole had made again and again, prioritizing profit and convenience over the lives of people who trusted his company to do right by them. Nathan didn't know how to tell Rosa this. He'd told her the truth about Miguel. He'd told her about the housing fraud in general terms. But telling her that his father's greed had touched her family not once, but twice, decades apart, felt like it might be the blow that finally, truly broke whatever fragile trust they'd built. He almost didn't tell her. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Nathan found himself seriously considering silence, not out of cowardice this time, but out of something that felt disturbingly close to self-preservation. He didn't want to lose what had grown between them these past weeks, not just Rosa's tentative trust, but the warmth of Ellie's hugs each morning, the strange, unexpected sense of family that had begun forming in a penthouse that used to feel like a very beautiful, very lonely tomb. But he thought of Ellie's small hand patting his cheek. "Good things take time, Mr. Nate." He couldn't build anything good on another hidden truth. That evening, he asked Rosa to sit with him after Ellie had fallen asleep on the living room couch, worn out from an afternoon of building elaborate block towers that Nathan had genuinely enjoyed helping construct. He told her everything Angela had found: Elena's name on the original tenant list, the unit she never received, the years of instability that followed, the possibility, however impossible to prove definitively, that a stable home might have changed the entire course of Miguel's life and, by extension, her own. Rosa listened in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face unreadable in a way that frightened Nathan more than anger would have. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long time. The city lights glittered outside the window, indifferent to the weight settling over the room. "I met Elena once," Rosa finally said, her voice distant, caught somewhere between the present and old memory. "Before she passed. Miguel took me to see her maybe a year before we got married. She was living in this cramped apartment with her sister's family, 6 people in 2 bedrooms. She apologized to me for it, I remember. Apologized for not having a proper home to welcome me into." Rosa's voice cracked slightly. She died thinking it was just bad luck. Just the way things worked out for people like her. She never knew someone had actively taken that stability away from her. "I'm sorry," Nathan said, the words feeling impossibly small against the size of what he was apologizing for. "I know I keep saying that, and I know it doesn't undo any of it." "No," Rosa agreed quietly. "It doesn't." She was silent for another long moment, staring at her folded hands. "But I keep thinking about something. 2 weeks ago, I was so sure I'd have to choose between hating your family's name and somehow finding a way to keep working for you. Keep letting Ellie love you the way she does. I didn't think there was room for both things to be true at once. But maybe there is. Maybe I can hate everything your father did, everything his choices cost my family across 2 generations, and still recognize that you are choosing, actively, painfully, to be someone different." "I don't expect that to make it easier," Nathan said. "It doesn't," Rosa said honestly. "But it matters. You didn't have to hire that investigator. You didn't have to dig until you found Elena's name. You could have stopped after Miguel, called it enough, protected yourself from finding out just how deep this goes. But you kept going. That tells me something real about who you're choosing to become." Nathan felt something in his chest ease slightly, though the weight of Elena Delgado's story, of a woman who died believing her hardship was simply bad luck rather than a choice made in a boardroom decades earlier, would stay with him for the rest of his life. "I want to do something for her memory," he said quietly. "Not just financial compensation, though I'll make sure that happens too. Something that actually means something." Rosa looked up at him, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "I might know exactly what that could be," she said. "But it's going to take both of us to make it real." Neither of them yet knew just how far that idea would eventually grow, into something that would reach far beyond their 2 families, into a legacy that would finally, truly begin to repair the damage 2 decades of silence had caused. The idea Rosa had in mind took shape over the following weeks, evolving from a quiet conversation into something neither of them had fully anticipated. It started simply enough. A scholarship fund, Rosa suggested, named for Elena Delgado, meant to help children of construction workers access stable housing and education regardless of what happened to their families. But as Nathan threw himself into the planning with the same intensity he'd once reserved for hostile takeovers and market strategy, the idea grew larger. He didn't just want to write a check and attach his family's name to a plaque. He wanted to build something that actually addressed the gap his father's company had exploited. He established the Delgado Foundation for Housing Stability, an organization dedicated to auditing housing grants across the city, ensuring subsidized units actually reached the families they were promised to, and providing emergency housing assistance to families who lost a primary earner, the way Rosa's family had lost Miguel. He didn't run it himself. He made sure of that, aware that his name attached too visibly to the leadership might feel, to outside observers and to Rosa herself, like an attempt to launder his father's legacy rather than genuinely repair the damage. Instead, he asked Rosa if she would consider directing it. She'd stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "I clean houses for a living, Nathan. I don't run foundations. You understand exactly what these families need better than any consultant I could hire," he'd said. "You've lived it. That matters more than a business degree." It took her another week to say yes, and even then, only after insisting on formal training and a proper staff to support her, unwilling to walk into the role unprepared. But by the time the foundation's doors opened 4 months later, in a modest office space 2 blocks from the building where Miguel had died, Rosa Delgado stood at the front of a small gathering of former coal construction workers, community organizers, and city housing officials, and gave a speech that left very few eyes in the room dry. She spoke about Miguel, about Elena, about the years of believing bad luck alone had shaped her family's hardship, before learning that choices, made deliberately by people who would never have to live with the consequences, had shaped it instead. She spoke about grief transforming into purpose, about refusing to let her husband's death or his mother's hardship become simply another buried statistic. Nathan stood at the back of the room that day, not seeking attention, watching Rosa speak with a confidence and clarity that made something swell painfully in his chest. Pride. Though he understood he had no real right to feel proud of a woman who had built her strength entirely on her own, long before he'd stumbled clumsily into her life and disrupted it with buried truths. Ellie, now closer to 4, sat beside him in a small chair, swinging her legs and occasionally tugging his sleeve to whisper questions about why everyone was clapping. She didn't fully understand yet what her mother had built, or what her own late-night song months earlier had ultimately set into motion. To her, it was simply a nice room full of people who seemed happy, and her mommy talking in a serious, important voice, and Mr. Nate beside her, steady and warm in a way he hadn't quite been when she'd first met him. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse and Rosa accepted handshake after handshake from people whose lives the foundation would soon touch, Nathan found a quiet moment beside her near the window. "You did that," he said. "Not me. Whatever guilt drove me to fund it, whatever truth I uncovered, you're the one who turned it into something that will actually last, actually help people." Rosa looked at him for a long moment, something soft and searching in her expression. "We did it," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have built this without the resources, without you choosing again and again to keep facing the truth instead of running from it. That matters too, Nathan. Don't dismiss your part in this just because it started with guilt." Nathan looked out at the room, at the families gathered, at the plaque near the entrance bearing Elena Delgado's name alongside a simple inscription about the foundation's mission. Every family deserves the home they were promised. "I used to think building something meant glass towers and quarterly profits," he said quietly. "I don't think that anymore." Rosa smiled, tired but genuine, the smile of someone who had walked through devastating grief and impossible anger, and had somehow found her way to something like peace on the other side. "What do you think building something means now?" Nathan glanced down at Ellie, who had wandered over and was now leaning sleepily against his leg, thumb hovering near her mouth the way it did when she was ready for a nap despite her best efforts to stay awake for the exciting grown-up event. "This," he said simply. "People. Trust. Showing up even when it's hard, even when the truth is ugly. That's the only kind of building that actually lasts." Rosa didn't say anything for a moment, just watched him with an expression that had shifted, slowly and undeniably over the past several months, from wary distrust into something warmer, something neither of them had explicitly named yet, though it hummed quietly beneath every interaction, every dinner, every evening spent around a kitchen table that had once belonged only to a lonely, sleepless man and now belonged, in every way that mattered, to the beginning of a family none of them had planned for but all three had somehow found. What none of them could have predicted on that quiet afternoon in the Foundation's new office was how far this story would eventually travel. How a scholarship fund named after a woman who died believing her hardship was simply bad luck would, within a year, grow into something that would change housing policy far beyond the walls of Cole Construction's old projects, and how a little girl's bedtime song would ultimately be credited, in interviews and articles neither Rosa nor Nathan ever expected to give, as the small, unlikely spark that started it all. A year passed, and the city had changed in small, meaningful ways that most of its residents would never trace back to a single sleepless night in a Manhattan penthouse. The Delgado Foundation had grown far beyond anyone's early expectations. What began as a modest scholarship fund and housing audit initiative had expanded into a citywide watchdog organization, credited in local news coverage with recovering misused housing funds from 3 separate developments and helping over 60 families secure the stable homes they'd been promised years earlier and never received. Rosa's name appeared in a city council hearing transcript, testifying about housing accountability with the same quiet, unshakable conviction she'd once used to comfort a grieving, guilt-ridden billionaire in his own kitchen. Nathan had restructured Cole Construction from the ground up, implementing independent safety audits on every project, severing ties with the executives who had helped his father bury the original incidents, and donating a significant portion of the company's annual profits directly into the foundation Rosa now ran. He no longer measured his success in headlines or valuation. He measured it in a much quieter, much harder metric: whether the people his company touched were better off, safer, more stable, because of choices made in his boardroom. He still lived in the same penthouse, 62 floors above the city, though it looked different now. Ellie's drawings covered an entire section of the refrigerator. A small reading nook near the window held a growing collection of picture books, and the silence that once filled every room had been replaced by something warmer, messier, alive. Rosa and Ellie had, gradually and without any single dramatic moment marking the change, become fixtures in his life that felt less like an arrangement and more like family. Nathan and Rosa hadn't rushed anything. Grief and trust and love, they both understood, couldn't be forced onto any convenient timeline. But something had grown steadily between them over the past year. Quiet dinners turning into quiet understanding. Understanding turning into something neither of them needed to name out loud to feel it settling, solid and real, into the foundation of both their lives. One evening, almost exactly a year after that first sleepless night, Nathan found himself once again lying awake, staring at his ceiling. But this time it wasn't grief or guilt keeping him from sleep. It was something closer to gratitude, a feeling so unfamiliar a year earlier that he almost hadn't recognized it when it first began creeping into his chest. He heard soft footsteps in the hallway and looked up to find Ellie, now 4 years old, standing in his doorway in her pajamas, stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "Can't sleep either?" Nathan asked gently. Ellie shook her head, curls bouncing, and climbed up onto his bed with the same fearless certainty she'd shown that very first night. "Mommy's already asleep," she said. "But I wanted to sing to you. For old times." Nathan felt his throat tighten, the same way it had a year earlier, though this time the tears that gathered in his eyes came from a very different place. "I'd love that," he said quietly. And so, once again, in the golden lamplight of a room that used to feel like the loneliest place in the world, a small girl began to sing the same simple, imperfect lullaby her mother had written out of grief years before either of them had been born into each other's lives. Nathan closed his eyes and listened, and this time when tears slipped down his face, they didn't feel like grief breaking him open. They felt like proof of everything that had been rebuilt in the year since that song first reached him. Here's what this story leaves behind, long after the credits of this moment fade. Sometimes the people who save us don't arrive with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes they arrive small, barefoot, and unafraid, offering nothing but an honest song and an open heart, at exactly the moment we've forgotten how to ask for help. And sometimes the truth we've spent years avoiding isn't the thing that destroys us. It's the very thing that finally sets us free to build something real. Nathan Cole spent 30 years believing that building meant glass and steel and staggering wealth. It took a 3-year-old's lullaby, a devastating truth buried in an old file box, and a woman brave enough to demand honesty even through her grief, to teach him what building something that actually lasts really means. If this story moved you tonight, even just a little, I'd love for you to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story find the people who might need to hear it most. If you're new here, consider subscribing, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. And if you know someone who could use a reminder that it's never too late to face the truth and build something honest, please share this with them. Thank you for staying with me through this one all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next story.